Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today, you're not going to believe this, but I'm going to be talking about swamp monsters. Now, you've already heard me rant about how much I don't like swamp monsters. I did a whole video about things I don't like that are driving up prices, and one of them is swamp monsters. So it might surprise you that I'm doing another video about swamp monsters, and it's not because I dislike swamp monsters. It's also not because I like swamp monsters. So nobody talked me into how great swamp monsters are. I still don't care about swamp monsters. However, what I do find interesting are collectors and the collector mentality and how completely arbitrary in some ways the decisions are that collectors as a community make in terms of what's an important issue, what's a first appearance, what's a cameo, all that sort of thing. And there's a lot of examples of books that, if you look at one series and the way uh, collectors treat this character's first appearance, it's completely different from how they treat that character's first appearance. And I find that sort of stuff interesting. There's a lot of examples of things that I find very frustrating. Just some examples, for instance, anyone who tries to tell you that Conan 24 is the first full appearance of Red Sonja is completely misinformed or outright lying, because 23 is a full appearance. But there's also things like, Wolverine's appearance in Hulk 180 isn't considered his first appearance, even though he appears in it, because it's a cameo. But there's other characters, for instance, like Darkseid in Jimmy Olsen 134 has a much smaller single panel, a much crappier single panel, but for some reason that's considered Darkseid's first appearance. And a lot of it comes down to, really arbitrary stuff, like covers, particularly since CGC. Which book has the nicer cover? That's the one we're going to pretend is the first appearance. Blah, 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 blah. So where do the swamp monsters come in? Well, one thing that I find really interesting is how and why House of Secrets 92 is considered the first appearance of Swamp Thing. And we're going to be talking about it in the context of a couple other first appearances of Swamp Thing, one of which is this here. It's Phantom Stranger 14. Now look at the Spectre of the Stalking Swamp. Now, if you look at this book, for instance, on eBay, you're going to see a lot of listings that say something like Swamp Thing prototype. And so as a result, copies of this might cost you $40, $50, $60, $100 in nice condition, because it's got a prototype of Swamp Thing. Now, other people are going to point out that this issue came out after House of Secrets 92. So how could it be a prototype of Swamp Thing if Swamp Thing has already appeared? Great question, and normally I would completely agree with that. However, in this case, I actually disagree. I feel like this is legitimately, one could make an argument that this is legitimately a prototype for Swamp Thing, because I don't believe, under the normal ways that we consider first appearances of characters, that you would consider Swamp Thing 92 to be the first appearance of Swamp Thing. Now, the reason I say this, for those of you who may not be that familiar with Swamp Thing, and I can't say I'm an expert on Swamp Thing either, because why would I want to do that? But the story of Swamp Thing 92 is a one-off, where there's a swamp monster called the Swamp Thing who looks just like Swamp Thing, because that's the deal. At the end of that story, I can't remember if that character dies or disappears, but whatever. The important part is, when Swamp Thing #1 came out later, a fair amount later, when Swamp Thing #1 came out, there was a new character. Now it's Alec Holland, and there's a new backstory. It's a completely different story with a completely different person turned into the Swamp Thing, a muck monster that looks exactly like the Swamp Thing from issue 92, and it's also called Swamp Thing, but it's a completely different character. It's that character, the Alec Holland, who is introduced in Swamp Thing #1, that is actually Swamp Thing in all of the other Swamp Things. So everything since Swamp Thing 1 has basically been, I mean, there have been occasionally other characters, just like you've had other characters take over as Captain America, But generally speaking, the movies are about the Alec Holland version, the TV show is about the Alec Holland version. The Alec Holland version has been the main character of the series. The Alan Moore series is about Alec Holland. So that's Swamp Thing. That is not the character that's in House of Secrets 92. And so I think you could make a real argument that the character in House of Secrets 92 is a tryout for Swamp Thing or a prototype of Swamp Thing, and that the real first appearance of Swamp Thing is in Swamp Thing #1. Now, there's a lot of gray areas with this because collectors seem to treat this very differently with everybody. I think the closest parallel that comes to mind for me is the Valkyrie. So the first appearance of Valkyrie is supposedly in Avengers 83. But if you read Avengers 83, she's right on the cover, and the story is that this character Valkyrie shows up and basically convinces all these female superheroes to start this women's liberation front. And but then it turns out at the end that she's actually duping them. And that the Valkyrie is just a fake persona of the Enchantress. Well, people apparently must have someone either in the company or the fans or somebody really liked the Valkyrie, the name, the look, the whole thing. So not long after this, in the pages of Hulk, there was a character named Barbara Norris who'd been appearing, and that character then became possessed by the spirit of Brunhilde the Valkyrie, and transformed her into the Valkyrie. And so basically the way they retconned it is that the Valkyrie, Brunhilde, was an actual character, and that in Avengers 83, the Enchantress was just disguising herself as a character that we as readers had just never heard of before, but she knew, right? And so the real Valkyrie doesn't appear until later, and I think it's Hulk 139 or 138 or something like that. I forget exactly, but that's where the real Valkyrie actually appears, and that's the character of Valkyrie that has appeared ever since. And yet, similar to House of Secrets 92, Avengers 83 is kind of considered the first appearance of Valkyrie. It's the first appearance of the costume. It's the first appearance, of the visuals. It's the first appearance of the name, but it's not the first appearance of the character. And that's very different how some other things are treated. So, for example, one example we've talked about here just recently is Strange Tales 114 versus Avengers #4, because Strange Tales 114 is actually the first Silver Age appearance of Captain America, but it turns out in the story that it's someone that's not Steve Rogers, it's someone in the Captain America, persona, and that when that issue was popular, then they brought Steve Rogers back in Avengers 4 for the first Silver Age Captain America. Now, in that case, collectors treat that as the most important because in continuity, that's the character. So they treat it completely the opposite. Logically, I think that Swamp Thing 1 should be the more important book. It's hard to say because, of course, without the success of House of Secrets 92, they wouldn't have done Swamp Thing 1. But to me, it's really a tryout or a prototype of the character. Stan Lee was famous for doing all of these prototypes for these different characters before actually giving them the real first appearances in Marvel. There's a lot of examples. And so to me, calling House of Secrets 92 the first appearance of Swamp Thing is sort of like calling Strange Tales 97 the first appearance of Uncle Ben and Aunt May. Because for those who aren't familiar with that issue, there's a story by Steve Ditko where there's an older couple named Uncle Ben and Aunt May who look exactly like Uncle Ben and Aunt May from Amazing Fantasy 15, but it predates Amazing Fantasy 15. So collectors have an interest in it, but they consider it a prototype, not the actual first appearance. So how does this come back to Phantom Stranger? So I'm going to try and tie this all together. After House of Secrets #92, but before Swamp Thing #1, there was this story. And this story with the Swamp Monster was written by Len Wein, who created Swamp Thing and wrote both of the others. In the story, what happens is we learn that there was this there's a swamp, and we learn that the legend has it that 100 years ago or something, there was some family there, and there was a guy who was consumed by the swamp, and it turned him into this swamp monster that they call the Swampster, which is a terrible name. And then as the story goes along, the Swampster's around and grabs someone, and turns out that the current the creature running around right now as the Swampster is not this legendary figure, but it's actually a guy in a costume who's using the legend of the Swampster to scare people off, right? But then at the end of the issue, that guy is killed when the swamp rears up and attacks him and drags him down. So the sentient swamp absorbs him, and you're left with the idea that the swamp maybe is alive. Maybe the story of the Swampster, the legendary Swampster, was real, and it has the same themes as a lot of the other Swamp Thing things, because it's specifically said that the swamp is that when the swamp kills the guy, it's to protect the environment and save the earth from the environmental dangers that have been happening, right? So it's thematically in there, and it comes before Swamp Thing #1. So to me, I think it's a very important bridge in some ways between the one-off horror story in House of Secrets 92 and the ecologically minded stories of Alec Holland as Swamp Thing #1. I think you could make a good case that both House of Secrets 92 and Phantom Stranger 14 are prototypes for the Alec Holland Swamp Thing. And so I think this is actually undervalued and underrated as a minor key. I think it should be a bigger book. To bring it back again to the Valkyrie example, for instance, later on in the Alan Moore run, there was this retcon to try and bring the House of Secrets 92 Swamp Thing into continuity. And Alan Moore introduced this thing called the Parliament of Trees, and you discover that there's a legacy of the Earth creating Swamp Things to protect the Earth. So there have been hundreds of Swamp Things over the years, and the Swamp Thing in House of Secrets 92 is explicitly mentioned as one of the previous Swamp Things that had been brought into existence. I don't know if they explicitly, because I haven't read the whole story, mentioned this Swamp Thing in that story, but given that retcon, I think you could very easily extrapolate that the swamp monster in this Phantom Stranger may be one of the other Swamp Things as well. So that, to me, that retcon is similar to the trying to explain why the Enchantress made up a costume that looked exactly like another character that shows up later. Is because, oh well, she based it on that character. It's just she had seen the character, but we hadn't. Same sort of thing here to me. So anyway, that sort of thing I find fascinating, like how the collectors decide what's an important first issue and what's just a prototype, what's a cameo, what's a tryout, and the reasons vary wildly. But it's interesting to me because in most cases, particularly the older school stories that have been around a long time, the collectors tend to fall on the side of continuity and who the character is and what the story is. And House of Secrets 92 is an outlier for that, because it's an instance where they don't. Because if they did, Swamp Thing #1 would be the more important book. So I just find that very interesting, even though it involves swamp monsters. So let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you next time.